And it was fascinating. And he also did his Great Escape, how they manufactured tools to get out.
Yeah, so, yeah, I posted it on That was the point of joining us. You? Well, I was in New York in February. It was strangely warm. I have to say, we're eating lunch outside. It's not normal now.
So welcome to the second of this year's Cambridge Climate Lecture Series talks. The first, which is available to view on the website. Kevin Anderson spoke to us about his views on carbon credits and levelling things up. Today we have Daniel Zeichner, Labour MP for Cambridge, Shadow Environment Minister. And it's great that he's come to talk to us. Some of us have met him informally just on his beat going around Cambridge. So, well, Daniel, will you come here and welcome to Trinity College Cambridge. I don't know whether you knew David Mackay.
I knew of David.
So David Mackay, he died, what, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and we set this lecture series up in his memory, and it's great to be able to do this. David was a great thinker and doer when it came to sustainable energy, and we sorely miss him, but we've got to get on with things. So, over to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much. And it really is a pleasure. I've often been in this lecture theatre, and this is, I think, probably the largest audience I've ever drawn. That's good, I tell you. And I'm pleased. And I hope you enjoy what I'm going to have to say over the next few minutes. The title is very wide-ranging, and I'll kind of give you a caveat at the beginning. I'm a Shadow Environment Minister with a particular responsibility for the food system, and I will come on to some specific comments on that. But I will talk in more general terms first. Just a little bit about me. It's very nice to see some familiar, friendly faces in the audience. And I've had the privilege of representing Cambridge since 2015. It took me a long time to get that far. So I sometimes say to people, people often think politicians are career politicians. Pretty bad idea being a Labour politician who's a career politician in the east of England, I can tell you. So it took me 20 years of trying. And it probably, as I often say, it's thanks to Nick Clegg, because Julie was an excellent predecessor. But there are times in politics when there are things that are going on nationally, which mean there's not much you can do about it as an individual. It was a very close election back in 2015. And I was very lucky to be elected, but as I also point out, I'm not always cheerful people. The world seems to have gone totally haywire ever since 2015. I claim no responsibility for that. I hope there isn't a causal link. But it has been a very curious time in politics. That's one word where you could be more depressed about it since 2015. The difficulties not just Britain's gone through, the United Kingdom, but the world in general. So we're not in a great place, I would say, but I'm an eternal optimist. And all the challenges we face, obviously climate change, still, to my mind, is the key one, which is why I'm very pleased to be talking about it. I've been a Shadow Environment Minister for 3 years. I was kind of slightly accidentally appointed because there weren't many people left on the Labour benches after the 2019 election. And I'd already had left the front bench over my enthusiasm for staying in the European Union, which slightly exceeded the enthusiasm of my then front bench colleagues or something. So I was a bit surprised to be asked back. I was absolutely delighted, because the environment brief was one that I would always have sought. And I was immediately thrown in about a week later to one of the biggest pieces of legislation in terms of changing the food system that we've had for half a century, and asked to lead on it, which was challenging, it's fair to say, but fun. I really enjoyed it. And subsequent to that, I sat on the Bill Committee for the Environment Act, which it does intrigue me, because there's lots of interest in environmental issues, but I have to say precious little interest in the legislation that's not allowed to make out. So we spent many happy hours. I was with my colleague, Dr. Alan Whitehead, who was leading for Labour on the bill. And I think somebody does bear looking at and reading, but over the years that have followed, There's been lots of secondary legislation that's followed from it, as the government has enacted what it cheerfully called its 25-year environment plan. I pointed out it was supposed to be for 25 years, not take 25 years. But we're about 6 or 7 years through the process now, and the government has just succeeded in basically weakening quite a lot of environmental legislation, in my view, because it was quite strong in the European Commission prosecuting. Now we have the Office of Environmental Protection, which is, although I actually have to say, I came out with quite a damning report a few months ago after its first year's inquiry, actually is still largely subject to the control of the Secretary of State, which is a rather different position to be in. So, I mean, my overall view is that although our environmental legislation has been severely weakened, we use it to best effect. And that is what we've got to try and do, what we've got at the moment. Although, of course, there's a possibility of an election, or certainty of an election sometime in the next couple of years. And hopefully that will then be the opportunity to strengthen lots of things. So I've been working on a number of these issues now for a few years. Again, I cheerfully say now that after 3 years doing brief, I now know how much I don't know, which is sometimes said to be a good starting point. And some of the people in the field prefer that to politicians who on day one think they know what the answers are. We've seen some examples of that in the last year, and that hasn't really ended very well either for us or for them. So what I'm going to do, first of all, just reflect a little bit on the fact that, I mean, being the Cambridge MP in this job is just absolutely fantastic, because virtually all the world's expertise is located in this city. And I often say that I get most of my information just by being on the train. And truth be told, just as I was writing that line tonight, someone came up to me on the train and bent my ear on something very helpful, I have to say. But we are in a city of remarkable talent and knowledge, and lots of brilliant work going on in related fields. And certainly the organisations, and thank you for organising this. Some of the organisations involved, of course, are hugely important and helpful. Generally, my first port of call on most queries and questions is the Attenborough Centre in one form or another. And a number of you will know that I've come to speak to you on issues. And of course, we've got some really good work going on locally. The work that Baroness Brown led for the committee, the combined authority, in terms of drawing up a climate change plan that came from Peterborough, I think was particularly impressive. And I know that some of the engineering solutions, we're talking about this just now, are sometimes seen as somewhat controversial, but I think some of the work that is being done and is being looked at could be really significant and really important. And I hope you had success now, because I've tried to help on occasions to get support for some of the work that's being done. And you asked me to touch briefly on the Future Generations All Party Parliamentary Group. Some of you won't know either what that is or what an All Party Parliamentary Group is. Basically, it's a cross-party group of MPs who have an interest in something. And I was approached by some people from the Centre for Existential Risk in the university some years ago now to see if I would help them set up a group. And I was very impressed by what they had to say. I was also impressed by the fact that Martin Rees was involved. It was kind of a good clue to the idea that it might well be sensible and important. And so we did set it up. I actually chaired too many all-party groups. I've actually handed over to one of my colleagues to chair. But the work they do, I think, is significant. And when you begin to step back and think about some of the really big issues that may be facing us in the future, it makes you realise just how very, very short term a lot of our political thinking is. And that's kind of endemic, but it would be good to challenge it. And of course, in Wales, they have actually got a Future Generations process, which does require legislators to look at the impact on future generations. And I'd like to think that we might be able to adopt something similar in the rest of the UK at some point in the future. And whether we will, I don't know, but I think it's certainly a worthwhile ambition. There's also some actually very interesting practical work being done in and around Cambridge. More perhaps on the nature recovery side. The Food and Farming Countryside Commission have got 2 pilots, one of which is in Cambridgeshire. And Dave Reynolds, who some of you know, has been very instrumental in working with a whole range of others in and around Cambridgeshire on that. And I think we watch that closely. And of course, we also have the whole clean tech cluster. I'm glad to see you here, which at a time when other parts of the world are, I would say, moving rather quickly. When you look at what's happening in the States, what's happening in Europe, on Ivan's announcement only a few months ago about the Green New Deal across the European Union, and it makes you realise that despite all the rhetoric about the UK being world beating and all the rest of it, on credit is precisely that, world is rhetoric, and it does not match reality. And I'll come back to some of those points a bit later on. You might want to raise them, but the world is reacting and moving now, and we are behind the curve, I would say. So I'll just say a little bit about the broad climate change points first, and then go on to talk a little bit about the things that I'm specifically involved in. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was real momentum, wasn't there, around the climate strikes, which I'm glad to see it being renewed, I think, in Cambridge. The work and the extraordinary leadership of Greta Thunberg showed there was a feeling that people had finally got it, that there was a real problem. And of course, the UK Parliament did declare climate emergency, but I have to say I never entirely felt the government was particularly committed to it. I think they felt probably the easiest way to get out doing anything was to basically say, yeah, we agree, and then carry on as usual. And that, I think, was always the danger and the risk, and I fear that is what they are doing. I'm not going to repeat the basic points. I think most people in this room would agree this is an existential challenge, and we need to get on with it. But the problem, I think, for me at the moment is the latest Prime Minister. Really, I don't think he has any commitment to this at all. And I won't make too many partisan points tonight, but when you look at it, I mean, he had to be shamed into going to COP27 by the fact that Johnson turned up. And he does have an unfortunate relationship with helicopters, it seems, which kind of, I think, give a clue to his personal view on some of this. You've got the Cumbria coal mine, which was approved. I thought it was very telling that when he issued his 5 missions, it seems we're in a 5 mission-based world now, but in his 5 missions, of course, climate and nature did not appear. And I think that tells you pretty much all you need to know about where the current government is on this. I supported Ed Miliband when he stood to be leader of the Labour Party. That didn't end entirely well, but him or the Labour Party, although it was the election I got elected, so I'm grateful to him for some things. But I've always been a big supporter of Ed. He's not. I don't think he's always been given the respect and that his work was deserved. I think it should be remembered that he was at the Department of Environment, Climate Change, Energy and Climate Change when we did have the Climate Change Act, and that was cross-party. To be fair, there were very few people in Parliament at the time who opposed it, but he has got a long record on these issues, and I'm really pleased that he came back into the shadow cabinet, and is clearly having a very, very significant role. And I think it's probably down to him that the Labour Party has now really put the climate issues right at the heart, not just of policy, but of economic policy. And that's a hugely important shift. I don't think anyone would necessarily imagine that that would happen. So it didn't happen by chance, it happened actually because he made very strong arguments, and Keir Starmer and the Tories were convinced. So he's, I think, made a significant contribution to the debate. And what he said about the last COP, well, he outlined 5 key actions which he thought we ought to be looking at. And he talked first of all about pressuring the big emitters, then supporting the most vulnerable, mobilising major business and financial institutions behind climate action, protecting nature, and investing in leading by example at home. And his view, and I think he's absolutely right, is that we've got to stick to 1.5. That's got to be our goal. And as people begin to kind of vary, sort of say, oh, well, it's too difficult, it's too hard, and the rest of it. No, we've got to stick with that. And what we need to make sure is that all those major emitters are compliant, and we shouldn't be allowing anyone off the hook. And that includes our trade deals. And this is where it comes back slightly to my group, because although trade deals are notoriously complicated and difficult, and UK politicians struggle with them, because for 43 years, of course, we weren't really doing them, we were part of the European Union who were doing them, it's pretty clear from the Australia and New Zealand trade deals that we sold ourselves short. And I shadowed George Eustace effectively for a number of years, and it is striking the difference in his tone now he's out of office. And his comments, I think I entirely agree. Basically, we gave far too much away. And the reason for that, of course, is short-term political vision. Basically, this trust trying to get free photo opportunities. And that's a terrible way of negotiating a trade deal. It's also pretty calamitous when you look at some of the climate implications, because we really didn't use that opportunity to press the Australians in particular to put 1.5 degrees as one of the key targets that we should be working to. So whatever we do here, and it's important we do the right things, it's only going to be successful overall if we get others to go with us, and particularly, of course, the developed countries. And also, particularly, obviously, we saw this at COP27, the discussions around how we make sure that there's some equity in this whole process, because quite clearly the developed world has gone first, has actually created quite a lot of problems, and it's perfectly reasonable for others to say, well, we need some help with that. So I think we absolutely need to have what it is called a high ambition coalition of vulnerable countries and developed countries to get that 1.5 degree commitment through. Now, clearly there was lots of discussion at the last COP around loss and damage. I'm not close enough, I'm afraid, to know, probably far more expert people in the room who followed it more closely than I did in terms of the outcomes. But I think some progress was made, as far as one can see, but much more needs to be done. And certainly, of course, in terms of the financing, inevitably there are going to be endless arguments about how all of this is financed. But we need to make sure that we get the contributions from, or the promises of contributions in some cases, and make sure that they are actually delivered. But of course, there is a problem in terms of trying to build a coalition, even though they're willing, if you're not setting a very good example yourself. And I think one of the difficulties was that you're trying to work with others. At just that point, the UK government, I don't know, three ago, I suppose, it's the Johnson government, of course, reneged on our commitments to international development aid. And that really wasn't a very good message to be sending to other people, that we should be working together to try and do these important things if you are basically reneging on agreements at home. So I think there are much, much better ways of doing things. Now, not everyone will agree with this point, but I actually think that the financial sector and the business community has got an important role to play in all this, because they actually, and what everyone's view of the private sector is, they have huge amounts of capital to invest, and quite often they're the ones who make decisions. Now, you can set regulatory frameworks and the rest of it, and that's probably the way I would like to do it. But if you can actually get them to come along and do some of the right things, that is certainly helpful. And they need to be mobilised on that, and there are parts of, not all by any means, there are parts of the corporate sector that I think do want to move in this direction. Now, sometimes slightly dubious, because some of it can end up being effectively greenwashing, and there's an awful lot of talk about corporate social responsibility, which I'm not entirely sure always converts into action. But I'd rather they were saying the right things, I'd just rather they carried on and actually did the right things too. And then, according to Carbon Tracker, the investments of companies and financial institutions based in the City of London account for approximately 15% of global emissions. That's rather suggesting, although we may only do a sort of 1% overall, we actually have got leverage over much, much more. So there are things that we could do, but of course that does require political will. We also need to make sure that there's the common standards which people are applying to, are held to account to. And that is a whole kind of world of its own, how to do all that. But we need to make sure that credible transition plans are brought forward, absolutely consistent with that 1.5 degree pathway, that we can then hold particularly FTSE 100 companies to account. And I think that probably could make a significant difference. Now, the fourth point that Ed makes is that sometimes this is kind of a climate discussion. As we saw at COP15, actually the nature and biodiversity crisis, I think, is interlinked. And obviously, we have in Cambridge, Professor Das Gupta produced a pretty profound and lengthy report last year, which I was slightly disappointed. I don't think it quite had the same effect on the wider public. I think the wider public can get that there's a climate crisis. I don't think we entirely get this nature and biodiversity crisis, which is inextricably linked and just as important. But the important work has been done, and we absolutely know that we've got to stop the process of deforestation around the world. Easily said, and much harder to do. And certainly Labour's view is that in government we have a net zero and a nature test on every major policy. And I know sometimes people are kind of cynical about this idea that you set tests for things, but actually, of course, it isn't the whole answer. But I think it does help that people are actually having to think about the implications. It doesn't mean they always do the right thing. I think anyone who's been a local councillor and all the rest of it will know there's often a list of things at the end of reports which say that certain things have been considered. And when I do secondary legislation in Parliament, it always says all these things have been considered by a minister. I do wonder sometimes just how much they've been considered. But at least it allows the opportunity of a challenge, and it should, I hope, make some difference. And then, of course, the finances are absolutely key. And the AVR has done quite a lot of work on this, and I'm going right back to earlier reports from 10, 15 years ago. The case has always been made it's actually more economically efficient to do the right things now than to wait longer and longer and have to fix the problems as they come up. Again, that is easy to say, quite hard to do at times of financial stress, but I see very little evidence. I'm afraid that's driving government thinking at the moment. Now, if we're able to get to clean power by 2020, which is the goal, not 2030, leave my glasses on, well, that would actually be well worth having just in terms of the cheaper energy bills. I have to say, it drives me to despair looking at our failure to do some of the most basic, simple things in this country. The fact, Cambridge is still subject to this. We live in lots of lovely houses, Victorian houses in Cambridge, which are still extraordinarily drafty. And the fact that the UK is virtually a developed nation, I think, which doesn't have a proper scheme to encourage and support people just in that basic act of home insulation is really quite extraordinary. And again, without being partisan, there have been a number of schemes that have been tried and failed over the last 10, 13 years. And really, there was an existing scheme that was in place back in 2010. And if the coalition government had just stuck with that, it would be much, much further forward. The last scheme, I think I actually challenged Boris Johnson on this at Prime Minister's questions. I can't remember the actual stats now. I think in his constituency, something like 60 projects have been carried out in the previous year. In Cambridge, it was 63. Well, I think under the Labour scheme, we're measuring it in thousands, not tens. So something's gone seriously wrong there. And maybe it was over-ambitious, maybe it's a classic thing of civil servants designing schemes that were over-grandiose, but let's do the basics, the basic lacking of the lofts and all that kind of thing. We are still losing far too much heat. Compare our energy efficiency of our homes with those in other similar European countries, and I'm afraid we're doing really, really badly. So just do the basics, get some of that right. And of course, the big economic pledge that Labour's made in opposition is the £28 billion per annum climate investment fund. Now, when that was announced, probably a year or so ago, that seemed like a big deal. Because I hinted in my introduction, when you see what Biden's doing, you see what the European Union is now beginning to do, that actually is not an outlier. Probably we need to do more. But the sad truth is, the whole government has got no such plan at all. They're piecemeal things that are done separately. So, in terms of the economics, I think we now know that this is not just a threat, it's actually a potentially huge opportunity. When you look at the new jobs, the new technologies, the new ideas that are coming through, we think this not only makes climate sense, we think it makes really, really good economic sense. So, Keir Starmer, on a number of occasions, taken the opportunity to set out his view that investment in clean energy technologies will be at the heart of our new industrial strategy. And he's committed to in delivering a fully clean power system by 2030. So I find that encouraging. I mean, I don't think it's easy. I think it'd be quite hard to do, but I think it's certainly important that is the key direction of travel from the opposition's perspective. Just a little in conclusion from the more detailed work that I do in terms of the food system. I never thought I'd find myself saying that I agree with John Gunn. But just as I found myself in the 2010 election, with Julian, we often found ourselves saying we agreed with Nick, and that was actually Nick Hillman, not Nick Clegg. But John Gummer, some of you may not be old enough to remember, but he was a Conservative minister who was very famous for force feeding his unwilling daughter a beef burger to prove that beef was safe to eat through the BSE crisis. I also found fair that politicians get remembered for their one duff moment, but that happens to all of us, so he may have had more than one actually. He later then reinvented himself and was instrumental in the 1992 Kyoto process at beginning to really get the climate issue on much higher up the political agenda, because it really wasn't there. And of course, as chair of the government's climate change committee, he's become quite a thorn in their side. He's very critical. He's not right on everything, I have to say, and it's still conservative, which doesn't preclude him, from my point of view, of being entirely right on anything. But on these things, he has been very, very effective. And one of his strongest criticisms is actually of DEFRA, the Environment Department. There's a point he keeps making, is they have no plan to get to net zero. And he's absolutely right. I mean, it is astonishing that the Environment Department is the one that is least well prepared. Because what everyone thinks about some of the other departments, you can see some kind of plan around transport, whether we will actually make that transition to electric vehicles. And of course, that isn't the entire answer, because we know there's a whole range of problems that come with them too. But there is thinking going on in that sphere. Even in the housing sector, despite my earlier criticism, I think one can see some kind of prospect of a plan, whether heat pumps will, whether we will make that work or not. But in DEFRA and in the food system, there really is no plan at all. And I'm afraid that the progress, if you call it that, or lack of progress in the agricultural sector, is striking. Really not that much has changed in the last few years, because there is no push, no oomph, I'd say. Now, Michael Gove was notoriously, I say notoriously, it's slightly unkind. He was probably the last Environment Secretary who really made much of an impact. I mean, I always thought it was actually the Michael Gove rehabilitation plan at the time. But he used his time at DEFRA to actually make a bit of a difference. It was he who set out the 25-year plan. And it was he who, very much under the influence of Dieter Hellmann, economist, introduced this notion that if we were to leave the common agricultural policy, it should be replaced by a system based on public money for public goods. Now, there may be economists in the room who will want to engage on this question. Now, again, I don't agree with Dieter Hellmann on everything, but actually on the climate issues, he's very strong. And we broadly agree, public money for public goods seems like a broadly good idea. You've got to then define what you mean by public goods. And the narrow economist's definition, in many ways, for some of us, is too narrow. We actually think there are social issues that stem from some of these decisions as well. But leaving that aside, that transition away from a very, very crude system of agricultural support, which widely felt has been instrumental in some of the environmental damage that we've seen right across Europe, was right to change that and make it much more focused and targeted on environmental improvement. The only problem is the way the government's done it. They've done it in such a way that it's not at all clear there will be any environmental improvement. And I spent much of my time in Parliament pursuing successive environment ministers, trying to pin them down on what is actually happening on that. And for those of you who do follow these things, it occasionally blows up and does end up on the Today programme or on the pages of the Guardian, so you do sometimes get some sense of this. The argument is basically that they've said to farmers, we will replace your £2.4 billion of agricultural support with environmental payments. I think most people took that to mean, I used to get this amount, and now I'm going to get the same amount to do environmental good. Well, it was a kind of sleight of hand, because what they actually meant was the overall budget will be available. Now, being available isn't quite the same as it being spent. And what we're discovering is that because the schemes, in a typically British civil service fashion, have been gold-plated and very complicated, and some of them are good in themselves, but they're complicated. So what we found is sort of the 80,000 or so people who were claiming, and so far only about 1,000 have taken up the alternative. Now, it's partly because it's relatively new, and we hope that uptake will go up. But my worry with this is what will actually happen is the money will actually go back to the Treasury, and that the money will come out of agricultural support, that actually smaller farms, which aren't always the most efficient, so it's a complicated set of processes, will come out of production, probably then be consolidated with larger enterprises who will not feel the need to be constrained by the new schemes which come with strings attached. And guess what? The end result is not environmental improvement, but actually intensification of some existing processes that are causing the problem. So as so often in public policy making, you actually get a different outcome from the one that was intended, and that is a persistent problem that we face. So we're halfway through the so-called agricultural transition at the moment. The thing which I find particularly worrying about it is there's no way of measuring what the impact is. You might have thought if you spend £2.4 billion of public money, you would have some kind of test as to whether it's going to achieve what you hoped it would achieve. Sadly, despite our best efforts to get the government to agree it would be a good idea to establish what is called baseline assessment, basic assessment of where we are now, so you can then reward people for improvement, they chose not to do that. So basically, they're handing out money to people to do what they hope are good things, and they hope that will lead to environmental improvement. Well, I hope they're right, but it's hope, and I think actually we need to do better than that. So, as I say, we're halfway through that transition. I suspect we're going to have to do a lot better to get agriculture away from the situation where it is still sadly a significant contributor to problems. And some of you who follow these things might have seen Henry Dimbleby's report. He was commissioned by Michael Gove to do a big report on the food system. And there was a lot of excitement around it, actually. When it's finally produced a year or two ago, it's a very big report. Perhaps I tend to summarise as saying we have an economically efficient food system that's destroying our environment and making us ill. So, the three key things that matter. One, yeah, we do get our food, although at the moment that's a little bit more precarious, but it's leading to an obesity crisis, which is causing crisis in the NHS. I think that's probably disputable, but for the purposes of tonight's discussion, it is doing endless environmental harm. And I don't blame necessarily the people involved who are doing this, it's just that all the pressures on them contribute to them really having quite little alternative to it. And what the challenge for me is, and for others, is to try and find ways of altering that system. It's a huge part. It's the biggest people don't always realise this. Food sector is the biggest manufacturing sector in the country, £157 billion sector, but only about 12 billion comes down to private producers, and that's why they find it difficult, I suspect, in a lot of cases, to do things which, in many cases, they would like to do. They're not all blameless, I have to say. Some obviously do the wrong things, but you add that to an environment agency that's been cut and doesn't have the resources to do any checking, and you can see why we've got to struggle to make all this work. So, and now just one final point on that. I was quite struck by a discussion again, Fiona Reynolds is involved in this, about how we move some of these things forward, possibly through something like a national land use framework. In Northern Ireland, they actually did do that basic assessment work, and which puts them in a much better position. So there are some ways in which we could actually deal with some of this. So my conclusion, and others may disagree in the room, but I'm increasingly concerned that for this government, climate issues are an afterthought. And where they do mention them, and it's partly because for them it's just about survival. The trouble is, for them it's about survival of their government. I think for the rest of us, the climate issue is about our survival. And that's why it's so important that they do move centre stage. And I genuinely believe that with a change of government, they would do that. So our promise is a fairer, greener future for everyone. It's a phrase, but within that, as you begin to unpack it, it would require a major change to many of our economic systems. It also might involve behaviour changes. And I think I've now spoken for quite a long time without even mentioning the issue that's so preoccupied so many people in Cambridge at the moment, so I'm not even going to mention it. But it just shows how difficult behaviour change is. Because even good people who will understand theoretically why they should change their behaviour, it's amazing how many people have told me they absolutely understand why we change our behaviour, but I don't understand why I should be charged to drive down a parking lot. So on that point, I shall conclude and say we've got to try harder. Thank you very much.
Very good, Daniel. Thank you very much. I think you might pleased to know that. Well, hands up who would identify as an engineer or near enough in this audience. So we're pretty keen to help them whatever way we can.
Very good.
We've got the director of the Centre for Climate Repair over there.
Yes.
I'm a member of that group. We've got the director for Sustainable Road Freight here. All very exciting. And so you did say that you're keen for engineering solutions. Do you have any kind of in mind, or do we want to talk about that over the glass?
Well, what I do know, I was happy to share a glass of wine, but well, what we do know is that it is a touch controversial, and that there are people who want us to tackle climate change who think that the only way to do it is through behaviour change. And I just don't see all these things as being mutually exclusive. Personally, I think if you've got a crisis on, you reach for anything that might help. So I can't speak directly to some of my colleagues who are more directly responsible for climate change policy. I'm certainly open to hearing suggestions. And as you know, we've had discussions before.
Yeah.
It's difficult because I know many people in this room will want detailed policy answers. The Labour Party is well schooled in losing elections. They're experts at it. And I hate to disappoint you, but I'm fed up with losing elections. I want to win the next election. And all the evidence is, I'm afraid, that the more detail you put out there, the more it then gets used, shamefully in some cases. I quite admire this pattern in many ways. I think it goes back to, some of you will remember, the 1992 election. And really, in most of my political life, it's been pretty hard to have a genuine, open, sensible discussion about things, but they're not going to be misrepresented on a giant billboard in the run-up to an election. So I'm afraid we're going to be pretty careful and pretty tight on a lot of things. So the broad thrust of the direction of policy I can give you, but I'm afraid to find detail, may have to come later.
So now I'm quite keen. We've got quite a few students. We've got some students from the local school here. Questions, preferably to start with, from younger people. Must be some. Yes, we've got one here.
Well, I suppose when we spoke about how much responsibility is in the UK and what we could do to influence other nations for us in this crusade against climate change.
So the question, just repeating for the microphone. So, what can we do in the UK in the way of leading the way?
Well, stop being such a catastrophically disorganised and untrustworthy country that breaks international law. I'm not about to start. It's an important point. I mean, I wouldn't use the word, it's not a criticism. Crusade makes it sound like it's some kind of moral mission. Actually, this is practical, and for many parts of the world, this is an imminent, very, very practical matter of life or death. So, of course, there is a moral dimension to it in some ways, and it's the right thing to do. But it is also absolutely the right thing to do economically, also in terms of international security and so on. I mean, as we begin to see sea levels rise, as people begin to move, and when you look at the extraordinary reaction there is to relatively, compared to other parts of the world, small numbers moving close to this country, imagine if we had the kind of numbers that other countries have faced moving. You can see the political difficulties that follow from that. So there's a real imperative from our own interest to actually do this. But if we're going to lead it, or if we, I mean, what's this thing that Britain somehow thinks it's got to lead it? And I quite happily work with others. But if we're going to do that, you don't do it by as I say, by going down some of the paths that the current government's gone down over the last few years. when I go around and talk to people from other countries, they are absolutely staggered by what's happened in the UK over the last 5-10 years, because we used to be considered to be, I think it's fair to say, a kind of a country that used to be quite important, but still had a significant influence. Seats on the Security Council, the UN, all the rest of it. And we were respected. And we were respected partly because people thought we had a democratic system that worked, and we respected the law. We had a rules-based system. Now, Johnson has done this country no end of harm, in my view, no end of harm. And people thought, at times, he's a lovable bloke. I said, no, he's not. He's done us terrible harm, because not only did we have all the chaos and all the rest of it, but our place in the world and our opportunity to influence others has been so undermined by what's happened over the last few years. Now, it's not irrecoverable, I don't think. I think people do understand. It's not just us that's gone through a difficult period. I mean, the Americans obviously have the same kind of experience with Trump. But Biden has shown that you can actually begin to restore authority. Now, people may disagree with the extent to which that's happened, but I do think it's different. And I think we can do it too. As you would imagine, I'm no fan of Rishi Sunak, but I do actually think it's better having someone who is not liable to behave in the way that Johnson or Truss to some extent. I think it's a step forward, but I do think that actually what we need is a complete change. But I think in terms of policy positions, I think he's wrong. In terms of personal integrity and so on, I think at least we're back in at least on a civilized place rather than the very uncivilized place. I mean, what kind of country was it that's threatening to break international law to try and get its way? I mean, it's a shame.
So we've had Bryony Worthington speaking at this series, and she was the author of the Climate Change Act.
Yes,
which but that's enshrined in law.
Yeah.
Is this a law that we will break?
Well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because I mean, what it did was it said.
Can you explain what the Climate Change Act means? I think it's a rejection to 80% of fossil fuel use by 2050.
Yes, and of course, back in 2012, the world was different, wasn't it? We needed to move more quickly. And I think the key thing about that whole process is
2008 was the
2008. That's right. Sorry. But the key thing about that process was it set up a process, and whilst no government can really bind future governments, that whole process that was established, I think, has been really, really important. And having the Climate Change Committee there, setting the carbon budgets, allowing the people to test and check the progress that's being made. Of course, the problem is that it's all very easy to set targets until the years roll by and you find you're not reaching. And of course, that is to some extent what has been happening progressively as we go through. Had we done more earlier, it would have made it, of course, easier to reach that. So it's by no means foolproof. And in the end, you ask the question, will we break the law? Well, the government's already breaking the law constantly in terms of these targets and all the rest of it. So that is not going to be the whole solution. But I think it's a good start. But then you've got to have the political will to follow through. And I think that's what's been missing.
So, other questions? We've got another student here, yes?
So, I've already been sort of like climate laws and stuff, is obviously going to take different resources, and especially with the sort of cost of living crisis and stuff going on right now, where would your priority be, and like how would you fund that?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes, basically, it's how do you deal with how do you do this when there's a cost of living crisis on? And absolutely, the thing is, this has got to be done in a socially just way. And the TUC has always talked about a just transition, and they're absolutely right. But I don't think that they are in any way mutually exclusive, because if we don't get this right, then frankly, we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. And the point that my party is making is that this isn't adding to the economic cost. This is actually using it as an economic opportunity. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing happening in the rest of the world now. My worry slightly is, and this is what I'm hearing more and more, I'm afraid, is that because the current government is not really reacting in any kind of way to what's happening elsewhere, investment is now going actually not here, but absolutely into the States. And I suspect the same thing will happen as the EU gets into gear as well. So we may have 18 months before a change of government. Maybe this government will begin to notice what's going on and react. But I think ideologically it's probably unable to do that. It is curious. I mean, Sunak is odd, isn't he? I mean, he's the kind of very dry right-wing chancellor who's handed out billions and billions and billions through COVID, and has now had to also do some quite unconcerted looking things in terms of energy prices. But these, as Kira said, they're sticking prices all the time. What you actually need is a proper plan and also to believe in it. And I think that's the problem. This government doesn't really believe that this is the way to go. They still leave it to the market. Well, there's Liz Truss funds. The market sometimes responds, not in the way you necessarily expect.
Daniel, thanks for your talk. As you probably heard from David King and others, methane is a very serious issue, contributing about 25% of global warming. Do you think DEFRA, coming back to your patch, do you think DEFRA hasn't done anything about their net zero strategy because they don't want to face up to addressing the problem of methane emissions in the agricultural industry yet? And I know I can't ask you about policy, but is that something you're thinking about for future Labour government?
So this is the question about methane emissions and how we deal with methane emissions going forward.
Yes, of course, methane is slightly different from other. There's quite a learned debate about how you measure and analyse the impact all these things have. But do I think that's why DEFRA hasn't acted? No, I don't think it is actually. I think DEFRA has failed to act because DEFRA fails to act, sadly. And I mean, one of the challenges for me and my colleagues will be to try and get DEFRA to be a much more energetic, proactive department. Why they have consistently resisted coming up with a plan, I think is an interesting question to speculate on. I think it's actually because there's still a fundamental ideological view that says this is not the kind of thing that we do, and that's not my position. And I shall explain this to officials when we get the opportunity.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
You said you'd like us to move away from rhetoric, and you mentioned Baroness Brown's commission, climate change commission for the authority. She said 2 years ago that this region has 6 years left of its emissions budget, of its CO2 emissions budget, till 2050. It now has 4 years left. The Climate Change Act makes those emissions budgets legally binding, although, as we know, the government's already failing. If we move away from rhetoric, we have to look at what the implications of such a small remaining budget are. They have dramatic implications for how much car use we can have in our region, if we're going to meet the target, if we're going to stay within the law. They have dramatic implications for how many millions of tons of concrete we can pour into busways, what kind of building can happen, and so on. What we need to do in terms of insulation. I mean, it's hard to move away from rhetoric. And I think that the last point I made, one incredibly important move we have to make, which Kevin Addison made very clear, is we have to move away from talking about net zero. Net zero is a way of not meeting targets. And many reputable scientists are saying we have to talk about, and the engineering department here, Julian Allwood, says we have to talk about absolute zero.
So, do you want to respond to some of those points?
It's how do we move away from rhetoric and saying the really uncomfortable things that have to happen, which politicians by and large don't say.
Well, I think you find the reason politicians find it difficult is because we have to persuade people. And it's really hard to persuade people to change behaviour. I mean, as I say, just look at the debate that's going on in a city like Cambridge at the moment about a change, a relatively modest proposal to modernise our transport system leads to huge difficulty. And let's be under no illusion yet. I suspect if I ask for a show of hands in here, we'd find there's a lot of agreement on a lot of the big issues. If I took you to another part of the city, you would find almost 100% different view. And we saw this, I'm afraid, around the Brexit debate, that the country was completely divided. And I'm afraid partly what happened was the political class talked amongst itself for many, many years and failed to bring people with it. And that's why we ended up where we did. On many of these issues, the same kind of divisions are happening. It goes back to the very good point made earlier that for a lot of people, they're struggling to get through to the end of the week. We're seeing huge numbers of people turning to food banks. So for them, the crisis is very, very real and practical. As a Labour politician, I absolutely identify with that. So we've got to take people with us, and it's hard. But I do think having these processes which ratchet it up, and whether it's within the UK and the Climate Change Act, or whether it's the hugely complicated processes that go through internationally, it is hard, and no one should be under any illusion about this. But in politics, I think you've got to be an optimist and keep thinking that you can move people along. And I get that, but you can't do it without consent.
We can have a discussion afterwards. We've got other people with questions here. Yeah.
Do you think because the I don't know if the word is a term, how long a prime minister is in for, is it very long? And also how are they ever going to be able to see into the people when they're only ever considering what they're going to change?
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's about short-termism, I would say. Yeah. And that is a fundamental problem in democratic politics, I'm afraid. We've even had an argument about whether we have fixed-term parliaments or not in this country. And this trust lasted not quite as long as the lettuce. So, possibly it was too long. Maybe lettuces shouldn't last that long. That may be another issue. But it's a really important point, and it's really difficult because some of these decisions absolutely require long-term thinking. And it's much easier for people in opposition to say governments should always look to the long term rather than short term. But I think talking to colleagues who've had experience with government, you're constantly almost struggling to get to the end of the week. So to think about these very long term decisions is difficult. And that's why to some extent the international negotiations are so important, because it does allow leaders to some extent to kind of slightly step out of their own individual national politics. And often, but it goes back to my previous point, they've come up with solutions that the public hasn't really understood, or in some cases felt that they were consulted on and agreed to. And when it comes to them changing their lives, because in the end it almost always will require some kind of change, that's when sometimes, as we saw with Brexit, you get essentially a rebellion. And so that is what we're trying to do constantly. I mean, people might find it surprising because there's actually far more consensus at Westminster than you might imagine watching Prime Minister's questions. I must be careful what I say about my colleagues. I won't put numbers on it, but most of them, whichever party, actually have thought about these things, and a lot of them can be persuaded that there is an issue and something should be done about it. But then getting that converted into actually doing, goes back to Tony's point as well, doing what's needed is a different matter. And that's partly because we can only do what our constituents, in a way, will give us consent to do. So what we need is an informed dialogue between the people who can see from the evidence, and they're looking at the detail, back to the population. Now, we've had a number of tries of it in this city, citizens' juries and so on, deliberative policy making. I love that idea. That's the kind of politics I like doing. The only thing that bothers me about it is that with one or two exceptions, and those are always the most example from Ireland, where the debate on abortion was shifted by that kind of process. My slight worry is the people who are involved in it change their mind, but they don't actually turn up other people for it to really filter through. So these are the oldest questions in the book: how you make democracy work and how you make collective decisions. And some people say, well, you need a strong leader and you just force it through. Well, that's one way of doing it. But it's I think there are too many downsides to that, I'm afraid. Although on this, and I think David Ruxton's written very effectively on this, his view is that this could be the issue on which Western liberal democracies do fail, because it's such a big issue and it's so hard to persuade people. Well, it's like air quality. You know, the more we learn about what we're doing and how much damage we're doing to ourselves, the more obvious it becomes. We need to change behaviour, but because people can't see it, and it's not tangible in the same kind of way, it's very, very hard to persuade people. Again, look, I mean, not just in Cambridge, but look at the debates going on in London. Air quality has improved dramatically through the actions that the mayor's taken. There's an almighty rebellion going on in outer London just because, you know, he's offering to make them live longer. Well, you think it was kind of a good deal, but no, people react. And what we've got to do is find ways of explaining, bring them with us.
Thanks, Daniel. I would just comment that there are places where we take powers out of the hands of politicians, for example, setting interest rates. And there is a case for having some of these things not being political decisions and having standing committees, you know, that make decisions and just take it out of the political process. So that's just a comment on that.
Yeah, that's a fair reflection. I think to some extent the Climate Change Committee has sort of been that process, and it does provide independence. But in the end, even with there was even talk, of course, in some quarters, there was some talk during the Liz Truss time about taking that independence away again. But ultimately, the decisions will always come back to one hopes in democracy, to Parliament and the people who are elected. But I get your point that you can move it sideways and take it out of the political arena more. But I'm not sure that would solve the problem. For instance, if an independent body, we could call them Greater Cambridge Partnership, possibly, were to make the decisions, that would solve the problem. I don't think it does.
No. So that wasn't actually what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you about the current energy bill, which is going through the House of Lords at the moment. It's initiated in the House of Lords. It has some provisions in it about hydrogen trials, and those provisions which that change the Gas Act, which and compel homeowners to have hydrogen boilers installed to let the gas man in. So they change the rules about when the gas man can come in. Gas man is forced to be able to is able to force his way in to the house to change your boiler to put in a hydrogen boiler. Now, that's an interesting thing, particularly in the light of the recent scandal about smart meters and vulnerable people having their gas cut off and all that. But there's another aspect to this, which is that the overwhelming evidence, the evidence of the House of Lords Committee last week, the evidence of the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, the Chris Skidmore last week, 33 reports, peer-reviewed reports, independent reports, have all indicated that hydrogen is not going to work for heating. That hydrogen heating is just not going to be a thing. It's going to be far too expensive and far too high carbon. And so the question is, well, it's clear what's going on. There's all these bodies saying that there's no support for hydrogen for heating. On the other hand, there is All Party Parliamentary Group, like your own, on hydrogen, which is sponsored by.
It's not my group.
I like your own All Parliamentary Group. Right? There is an All Party Parliamentary Group on hydrogen, sponsored by the hydrogen industry and the gas industry, who actually give the money. Large numbers of cadent gas industry representatives going in and out of number 10. And this bill, which is in completely contrary to the evidence, overwhelming evidence against, in a country where we say we have evidence-based policy, overwhelming evidence is against hydrogen feeding, and yet the government is pushing through this bill which compels people to take part in hydrogen trials. Now, so I'm just wondering what you think about that, what Labor's position is going to be on that bill, and what you think about this situation where the gas industry lobbying can so affect the government policy that clearly stupid policy is being implemented.
Well, you don't need lots of lobbying to get clearly stupid policies. I mean, I haven't followed it as closely as you have, clearly. I'm not as down on hydrogen as you are. I mean, I certainly agree with you. There's been a very impressive lobbying organisation, but that doesn't make it wrong. It may do, but it doesn't necessarily make it wrong.
We have a glass of wine.
If we can have a glass of wine. I mean, here we go into blue, grey, green, rainbow hydrogen, all the rest of it. I genuinely think that, particularly with the offshore sector and the possibility of using surplus offshore and renewable sources, gives the opportunity via hydrogen to offer some really good possibilities.
But I think it's the kind of here, we mentioned David Kay earlier. If he were here, he'd tell you you're talking rubbish.
Well,
Physics does not support hydrogen for heating in any sense whatsoever.
I wasn't just talking about.
David would tell you that.
I wasn't just talking about heating.
That's what you're talking about.
That's what you're talking about. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this becomes a very animated debate around the place of hydrogen. I'm not going to defend anything this government does, so you don't have to put me in that pigeonhole. But all I would say is I wouldn't rule out hydrogen for a whole range of possibilities.
Well, but just let's
And
take this
on-
specific thing of
On
letting
heating,
the gas man in.
yeah, well, I haven't looked at that, and if it's as you say, I think that would be extremely unpopular.
It will be, and I just wonder what can Labor do about it in the face of a overwhelming majority against you?
Well, the same as we do every day, which is lose the votes. That's why you don't lose elections, because it's a very bad place to be.
And what can you
can't
do
change
about
anything.
what can you do about the lobbying which is clearly going on, causing this policy to happen?
Lobbying happens all the time, and it is, as I say, I don't think necessarily was a bad thing, because actually we need to be informed by people of things.
This is the fossil fuel industry doing the lobbying.
Yeah, and I totally understand that as well. All I'm saying is that I think there is a place for hydrogen in the future of our energy mix, and I wouldn't rule it out. I don't think just because people are lobbying about it means that you turn away from something which does have real opportunities. But in terms of what Labour would do, I'll have to talk to my colleagues about that. That's not within my part of the environment group.
So we've got a question over here, yeah.
Anthony, I admire your commitment to climate change, but your rhetoric is broadly similar to what I've been hearing for the last 30 years in the environment. I mean, if you could just try a little bit more mitigation, we'll be fine. I mean, I think that a time for more realistic approach is necessary, particularly considering your constituency in the east of England. We're not going to hit 1.5 degrees, we're probably not going to hit 2. We may well not hit 2.5 degrees, and there's at least a realistic possibility we're going to hit 3. Your constituency will be underwater if that happens. Is it not time to move beyond the debate that you're espousing and start to think about how we're going to cope in the world with large-scale population movement, the abandonment of large amounts of low-lying land?
No, I don't accept that we cannot do it. No, I'm determined that we do. Well, there are always what ifs in life, but what I don't think you do is you start from the premise that you can't succeed. I fully accept the fact that the clock is ticking and it's very urgent. And as you heard from my critique of the current government, I don't think they are now treating with anything like the seriousness that's required. But what I'm explaining to you is that the Labour Party absolutely does get it and is treating it with seriousness. But I'm afraid from opposition, all one can do is critique and oppose.
But why are we still building houses on land that would be underwater by the end?
Well, I'm not building any houses at all, I'm afraid. The current government is. I mean, this is the point. Look, in opposition, there's nothing you can do other than critique. What we're trying to do is win an election. Historically, it's been very, very difficult for the Labour Party. We don't win many elections. We're very good at losing elections. We've got to get better at winning elections to give us the opportunity to do some of the things that people in this room would like to see. And I keep going back to the same point. We've got to take people with us. And you're very welcome to come with me around parts of Cambridge where it is harder to run some of these arguments, I can tell you from experience.
So right at the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just pick up on that point about public consent, delve into it and get your thoughts, particularly around like, you talk about bringing people with you and like, I completely buy into that, but around what is in the realm of public consent and what kind of happens isn't in the realm of public consent. And you talk about we need public consent for a congestion charge or some of these sort of environmental policies. There's no public consent or kind of no debate about those consent for how expensive rail fares are now, or the fact that cars getting so much bigger that when I cycle around, they can't just see it's not enough. So why, it's a bit of a topic question, but like, why is it okay to have or need public consent for these kind of environmental issues, but some of the stuff is just kind of left to market or just kind of push replacement? And I wonder how we kind of retilt this rhetoric debate, actually, whatever you want to call it, to not railroad defenses and sort of things, but say kind of like actually we need these things to happen.
Yeah. Well, I'm a touch more optimistic than some of you are. I visit schools virtually every Friday, and it is quite striking that would be quite hard to run past an older audience, even in Cambridge. And Cambridge is pretty exceptional compared to other parts of the country. Amongst a younger generation, there's a real shift in attitude, I would say. So there's a generational shift going on. The question is, can we use that to move quickly enough to do the things that we absolutely need to do? And there is a real sense of urgency about this from some of us. My worry is that the national debate is actually going the wrong way at the moment. That we're hearing less about it. What is interesting to me is actually industry is up for this in a lot of cases. They really are. Again, not necessarily through selflessness, but because they can see economic opportunity. So if we can get the right policy framework in, then I think there's a lot that can be done quite quickly. And what strikes me is, despite on the one hand me saying it's very hard to take the public with you sometimes, actually other times I was astonished during lockdown that people did do what they were told. I don't think Boris Johnson expected it to be. He clearly is pretty reluctant. But at a time of when people could actually see there was a big problem, people did respond. Now, I think the difficulty, as I alluded to earlier, is it is quite hard to get it across to people. Now, during that very hot summer last year, I think people did suddenly think, whoa, this is something odd going on here. I don't want us to have to keep on having that kind of experience, but if that is the experience, I think we will begin to get more consent. But in the end, you just cannot ultimately do things over a prolonged period of time without public consent in a democracy. And if that is the challenge for people who are trying to challenge the conservative orthodoxy, not to let them just keep on winning elections and running on and on as things are and keep things the same. We want to change.
Well, look, I think what we'll do is we'll wind up and then we can hopefully have a bit of a chat over a glass of wine. We've got a whole heap of vegetarian and vegan wraps, which
That's even better.
Which do stay around. Just to say, unfortunately, next week, Aoife has had family issues and is unable to do our CCLS talk next week. So the next one we will have will be as part of the Cambridge Festival, which is on Friday,
17th of March. March 17th.
March the 17th. And that's going to be in the Babbage Lecture Theatre on the new museum site. Friday starting at 7 o'clock. We've got Guy Vince and Jonathan Porritt. And do we know if we're chaired with?
So far, I think not 100%, but it's like 99%. That would be Oliver Morton.
So Oliver Morton from The Economist hopefully will be with us as well. So just once again, really, Daniel, thank you very much for coming on, and we look forward to having a little further discussion.